Well, it's great to be back in a room filled with Oxfordians, isn't it? Yeah. To finally, again, be among people whose minds are actively engaged with what has been and still is the most important literary question of all time, that of who wrote the plays and poems known as Shakespeare's. The evidence in support of Edward de Vere's authorship has been accumulating for more than a century and is overwhelming. Uh-oh. All right, in fact, it was already overwhelming by the end of the 1930s, more than 80 years ago. In 1939, Percy Allen wrote that the orthodox traditional Stratfordian case is finished. It will no longer bear examination, whether from chronological, topical, or other viewpoints. The case for Oxford, as we can now present it, is substantially complete. It has never been answered and is, in my judgment, unanswerable. Again, that was 80 years ago. The evidence in support of Oxford's authorship is, in fact, far stronger than most people today realize, far stronger than even most Oxfordians realize, because considerable parts of the evidentiary basis for Oxford's authorship uncovered in the 1920s and 1930s has been forgotten. It's been lost to history because very few people have read the writings of the first generations of Oxfordian scholars, apart from John Thomas Looney's Shakespeare Identified. So what I want to do today is present to you the foundations of the Oxfordian claim as it was uncovered by that intrepid band of independent-minded scholars and researchers in the first 2 decades after Looney's great book was published. Before turning to the evidence itself, I want to identify the scholars who uncovered it. The 10 most important scholars are listed here in chronological order, in the order in which they began their Oxfordian work. The very first, John Thomas Looney, is known to all of us. He was followed by Colonel Bernard R. Ward and Captain Hubert H. Holland, later Admiral, and later by the Colonel's son, Captain Bernard M. Ward, Percy Allen, Gerald Rendell, Father Charles Sidney de Vere Beau Claire, and Ava Turner Clark. Note that the first 7 were all English. Clark was the first American, as were the 2 most important new scholars of the second generation, Charles Wisner Burrell and Louis P. Benezet. These scholars uncovered 11 distinct lines of evidence, lines that are biographical, topical, historical, poetic, and nature, and so on in nature. They're listed here and on your handout for easy reference. I want to take you through all 11 lines chronologically in the order in which they were first uncovered and presented, which will give you a sense of how the Oxfordian movement developed, as well as information about the lines of evidence themselves. But before I do that, I want to point out certain things of interest about the information on this chart. In column 2, you can see I've noted that the evidence in each line of evidence is of one or both of 2 types: documentary evidence and literary evidence. Documentary evidence is simply official records and personal documents such as letters from that time. Literary evidence is drawn from within literary works themselves. It's such things as portrayals in them of real-life events or people, and it often provides information about them not existing in the documentary record. Literary evidence is of great importance for the issue of the authorship of Shakespeare's works because so much of the documentary evidence has been, in support of authorship by any specific person, has been destroyed. As Charlton Ogburn Jr. concluded, a nearly clean sweep was made of contemporary documentation touching on the authorship. The fact is that every scrap of paper, The fact is that every contemporary document that may have related authorship of Shakespeare's plays and poems to an identifiable human being subsequently disappeared. Every last scrap of paper that would have told who Shakespeare was, whether Shakespeare or anyone else, simply vanished. To me, that is to Ogburn, there can be but one explanation for the empty-handedness of generations of scholars after lifelong quests. Someone saw to it that those quests would be fruitless. So, both types of evidence are necessary to piece together de Vere's story. Turning to Percy Allen again, he observed, "It's altogether a complicated business, so much so that where letters, documents, and other contemporary allusions to the matter are only source of guidance through the mazes, the solution could be little more than guessed at. Fortunately, however, we have the Shakespearean plays, which illuminate history when correctly interpreted, as much as history illuminates them. Column 3 in your handout and on the slide shows which scholar launched which line of evidence and when. Note that John Thomas Looney launched 3 lines of evidence in 1920, Percy Allen later launched 4 lines, and 5 other scholars introduced 1 line each. In your handout, I've added another column showing which scholars were most important in developing each line of evidence after it had been launched by another scholar. And now with the final column, the most important reason for this presentation is that of the 11 lines of evidence, only 4 are well known today. 3 lines of evidence are only partially known today, and 4 lines are almost unknown. So the purpose of this presentation is to bring all 11 lines back into scholarly awareness so that presentations of the full evidence for Edward de Vere can be presented and hopefully persuade more people of his authorship. Here's the 11 lines of evidence again, grouped by level of awareness of them today. Now, you might think I'm exaggerating when I say that major lines of evidence in support of de Vere's authorship have been lost to history, but I'm not. 7 lines of evidence are mostly unknown today or partially known because very few people since the Second War ended in 1945 have gone back to read the Oxfordian works published before 1937, with the exception of Shakespeare identified. Charlton Ogburn Jr. in The Mysterious William Shakespeare cites almost no publications prior to the Shakespeare Fellowship newsletter launched in 1937. Mark Anderson in Shakespeare by Another Name cites few works published before 1941, with the exception of Captain Ward's biography of Oxford. This slide shows the extent to which Ogburn and Anderson referred to the 10 most important scholars from the first generations. Even without reading all the details, you can see from the red font that Ogburn listed only 4 of them in the bibliography of his book and made no mention of 3 of them in the index. Anderson mentioned only 2 of the 10 in the index to his book and had no citations or only a few citations for 8 of them in the notes to his book. This slide matches the 2 authors with the 11 lines of evidence. The red font shows that fully 5 of the 11 lines of evidence were not discussed by either Ogburn or Anderson. The lines they did discuss are those mostly known today. The lines they didn't discuss are those mostly unknown today. So, Oxfordians who obtained their information about the Oxfordian claim from these 2 great latter-day scholars are left uninformed about aspects of the evidentiary basis for the claim not mentioned by them. All right, the first 4 lines of evidence are well known today, at least by Oxfordians, so I'll go through them rather quickly. The first type is biographical. Edward de Vere's life is just what we should expect to find Shakespeare's life to have been like. He was closely connected to literary works and people closely connected to Shakespeare. Works such as Golding's translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, which Golding translated while de Vere, his nephew, was his student, and Cardanus Comfort, which de Vere published in 1573. Writers such as John Lilly and Anthony Munday, whom Orthodox scholars regard as having influenced Shakespeare, were in fact servants of Edward de Vere. The lines of influence run from Edward de Vere to Lilly and Munday, and not from them to Shakespeare. We all know that, and someday everyone else will too. Looney also introduced the second form of biographical evidence, which consists of allusions in Shakespeare's plays to events in de Vere's life, and characters in the plays modeled after de Vere himself and after many prominent people in Elizabethan society known to him. Many of the play's principal characters possess traits or personalities similar to Oxford's own and express thoughts that someone caught up in the events of his life would naturally have felt in response to them. The third line of evidence, again introduced by Looney, is poetic. The first thing that struck him as he worked to uncover information about Edward de Vere was the similarities of themes, subject matter, tone, style, formal structure, phrasing and word use, meter and rhyming scheme, and quality between de Vere's early poetical works and Shakespeare's mature works. As one example, Looney found that Edward de Vere's poem on the loss of his good name and Shakespeare's sonnets on the same theme are the only poems of their kind with which we have met in our reading of Elizabethan poetry, the only poems of their kind, we believe, to be found in English literature. 4, that Shakespeare's works are intensely topical is well known to Oxfordians today, but Orthodox scholars are reluctant to acknowledge it. Admiral Holland found as early as the 1930s that Hamlet contains references to more than 50 events, 50 topical events, and that most of them refer to events in and around 1583, more than 20 years before the usually accepted date of composition of the play. The same is true for most other plays, which places them right in the heart of Edward de Vere's early and mid-manhood, and far too early for them to have been written by any other authorship candidates, whether Shakespeare, Bacon, or Darby. All right, the 5th line is historical, and it's only partially known today. It was introduced by Captain Ward and Colonel Ward in some 10 articles from 1928 to 1930 that revolutionized understanding of the conditions in which Shakespeare's plays had been written and first performed. In the first decades of the 20th century, scholars often referred to Elizabeth I's reign as a time of prosperity and plenty, as a golden age in Elizabeth's history, or England's history. Wikipedia still does. The Wards showed that wasn't the case at all. They showed that the war with Spain, far from ending with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, had continued until a peace treaty was signed by James in 1604 after Elizabeth's death. The continuing war resulted in conditions of great hardship, high taxes, and near famine during the latter half of Elizabeth's reign. It also resulted in the imposition of severe censorship to suppress criticism of the court, the government, and the Queen during those difficult years. Percy Allen built on the Ward's historical findings to show that dramatists of the time, when seeking to comment on contemporaneous events in their society, had to protect themselves from the censors by veiling their commentary behind seemingly innocuous cover stories borrowed from elsewhere. If challenged by censors, they could claim that their work was simply a retelling of a story from ancient Greece or Rome or contemporary France or Italy. This is a fascinating story, and I'd love to go into it more, but we'll have to pass over it. The 6th line of evidence, another form of biographical evidence, is the veiled portrayals of Edward de Vere, of Shakespeare, and of de Vere as Shakespeare that Ben Jonson and George Chapman inserted into their plays and poems. This line of evidence was introduced by Percy Allen and is mostly unknown today. One example is the lengthy description of Edward de Vere that George Chapman inserted into his play, The Revenge of Bussy. The passage itself is well known. We all recognize it. I overtook, coming from Italy and Germany, a great and famous Earl of England, the most goodly fashioned man I ever saw, and 'twas the Earl of Oxford. What's not well known is that the passage has nothing to do with the action of the play. By inserting it into a scene inspired by and copied from Hamlet, Chapman came as close as he dared to connecting Shakespeare and Hamlet with Oxford, and a connection that would have been easily recognized by educated audiences of the time. In another line launched by Allen that is little known today, he showed that the topicality in Shakespeare's plays wasn't limited to numerous but isolated allusions to topical events, but rather entire scenes and even entire plays were inspired by contemporaneous and recent real-life events in the courts of England, Scotland, and France. The clearest example of this is King Lear, which is, in the main, a dramatization of French history. Allen makes clear how intimately in setting, character, and incident the play is linked with the civil wars in France, which led up to and followed the massacre of St. Bartholomew. The scene on the heath, for instance, is drawn from Agrippa de Aubigné's Les Tragiques. The same book describes the 3 historical personages on whom the 3 witches in Macbeth were modeled, and contains lists of items with magical properties that Shakespeare drew from in creating the ingredients that the witches put into their cauldron. Allen further established Edward de Vere as the missing link between those real-life events in France and the depiction of them in King Lear, thereby providing another distinctive line of evidence in support of de Vere as Shakespeare. He provides a dozen or so instances of these links. I've mentioned two of them on the slide here. Now, Allen's most comprehensive presentation of his findings about the influence of French history on Shakespeare was in his 1933 book, The Plays of Shakespeare and Chapman in Relation to French History. And yet, Ogburn made no reference to Allen's book or to that French influence. Anderson made only one reference to Allen's book and didn't cite any passages from it. In writing on Shakespeare in France, he cites Sir Sidney Lee, Horace Howard Furness, Abel Lefranc, and other French scholars, but not Allen's important work. So, Oxfordians face a difficulty when critiquing Orthodox scholars for failing to notice important Oxfordian discoveries when they themselves also ignore them. And while I'm on the subject of important Oxfordian work unknown to today's scholars, I'll cite another example. Neither Ogburn nor Anderson made any mention of Allen's The Life Story of Edward de Vere as William Shakespeare, published in 1932. Allen's book, not Anderson's, was the first biography of de Vere as Shakespeare, yet it has been almost lost to history. Moving on to the next line of evidence, in the early 1930s, the Reverend Charles Sidney de Vere Beau Claire prepared mock-ups of 6 of the best-known portraits of Shakespeare. Pictured here is one of the dozen miniature albums of these comparisons that Beau Claire sent to John Thomas Looney, and that were among the papers I got from Looney's grandson a few years ago. So portraits by Beau Claire included those known as the Ashburn, Welbeck, Fenton, Grafton, Hampton Court, and Jansen, as well as the Drushout engraving from the first folio. After superimposing the images, Beau Claire demonstrated that they were so similar in all key aspects that they were, in fact, images of the same person, and that that person was Edward de Vere. Beau Claire's work is almost unknown today. Charles Wisner Burrell's work on the Ashburn portrait is well known, but his work on 2 other portraits isn't, the Jansen and the Hampton Court, which is why I say that this line of evidence is only partially known today. Gerald Rendell, perhaps the most respected scholar in England to take up the Oxfordian cause in the 1930s, after a careful study of Edward de Vere's handwriting, spelling, and punctuation, showed that careful correlation and comparison compels the conclusion that the autograph text of the sonnets, in almost every particular of script and spelling, conform to the pattern of Edward de Vere. This line of evidence is almost unknown today, which is why I will be republishing Rendell's book early next year. Turning to another historical line of evidence, Percy Allen and Captain Ward introduced what I call the dynastic succession theory. In their view, admit that Oxford and Elizabeth were lover and mistress, and the whole story of Shakespeare's plays and sonnets, however so strange and wonderful, becomes a coherent and easily comprehensible sequence of events. Deny our solution, and as it seems to us, you're driven back once again into the old cloudland of Shakespearean bewilderment, wherein all is seen as through a glass darkly or in a distorting mirror. Now, all of the key foundational documents of the dynastic succession theory can be found in one volume, Volume 6 of Percy Allen's Complete Writings on Shakespeare, which I published just last month, and which I'll talk more about in just a moment. Earlier, I noted that allusions to Oxford as Shakespeare in the plays of Johnson and Chapman form a critical piece of evidence in support of his authorship. Now I note that passages in the works of Johnson, Chapman, and Spencer that allude to the real-life events behind the dynastic succession theory also support de Vere's authorship. Allen demonstrates that the most convincing allusions to the Oxford-Elizabeth-Southampton relationships outside of Shakespeare's own plays and poems are found in the works of Edmund Spencer. Although Spencer, Allen writes, dared not, under his own name, treat very openly of matters so intimate in the life stories of those highest in the land, he was, nevertheless, fully conversant with and deeply interested in the whole business, since he returns to it again and again in his works, including Mother Hubbard's Tales, Muliopotamos or the Butterfly, and the Fairy Queen. Allen writes that he regards the interpretations of Spencer contained in chapters 7 through 9 of his book, Anne Cecil, Elizabeth, and Oxford, as of primary importance to the complete Oxford case. And yet this literary evidence in support of the theory is almost unknown today. I'll close by returning to the 10 major Oxfordian scholars of the first wave of the movement. This slide shows the number of lines of evidence launched by each of them and the number of lines launched by other scholars to which each contributed. Looney, as the originator of the Oxfordian idea, is in a special category. You can see that he launched 3 lines in his great book. Of the other 9 scholars, only one contributed to more than a few lines, and that's Percy Allen. He launched 4 new lines, more than anyone else, and contributed to all 7 others. And yet much of Allen's work has been lost to history. His 9 books and 5 booklets have long been out of print, and his 120 articles have never been collected until now. Because Allen's contributions to the Oxfordian claim and the Oxfordian movement have been so important and paradoxically so ignored, I've spent the last year bringing his complete writings on Shakespeare back into print in 7 volumes. These are not mere photocopies of his works. I've reset the text in a modern typesetting, added introductions and annotations, and bibliographies and indexes to make the edition as useful as possible. So my hope is that this new edition of Allen's collected writings on Shakespeare will result in greater awareness of the 7 lines of evidence that are lesser known or little known today, and that more comprehensive presentations of the full range of evidence in support of the Oxfordian claim will result in more widespread recognition of de Vere as the principal author of Shakespeare's works. I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you. Yes, Tom.
Of all the Oxfordians who have contributed to our modern understanding of the claim, Charlton Ogburn Jr. should be in command of what Percy Allen actually did. So how do you account for so little mention of him in The Mysterious William Shakespeare?
Yeah, well, first let me say that after Shakespeare identified, Charlton Ogburn Jr.'s The Mysterious William Shakespeare is the essential text that everybody should own a copy of. I actually went back and bought a copy of the original 1984 edition in addition to the second edition, which is what I read second, or which I read first. It was published in 1992. The amount of information in that book is overwhelming. You know, it's this thick, rather small print, and Ogburn must have decided that there simply wasn't room to put into his book, into one volume, everything that needed to go in there. And actually, it's interesting, he quotes a sentence from Percy Allen's The Life Story of Edward de Vere, which I mentioned, neither Latter-day Scholar mentioned, but he didn't cite where he got that sentence. So he was familiar with the book, quoted a sentence from it, but didn't give the citation for it. Don.
Bravo for your talk and bravo for your continuing work on finding our history.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I have just a very practical question to ask you. Mm-hmm. How can the SOF help you to promote these books, especially among our own people?
Well, cloning would be a good idea. But when you're doing what you love to do, you want to do it all the time. And so to produce these books back here and another 8 that are coming out in the next year, to bring all of the major works from the first wave of the Oxfordian movement back into print, it's what I want to be doing. And now that I'm retired from paid work, I can do work that's really important for me. So I'm hoping that all of you will find, some little way that you can, not little, but little or big, some way that something you love to do that supports the Oxfordian movement. Because if you try to do things that you don't really love to do, then you just do them as quickly as possible so you can get back to what you love to do. So, you know, look at the Oxfordian movement, see what it needs to have done, and find your little niche, you know, where what you love to do fits in with what the movement needs. And that's the way to go, because, you know, there are many things that you know, other people on the board or the president or, you know, there's things that they have to do to be successful in those positions. And there are things that I could possibly do if I forced myself, but I wouldn't enjoy it. So I would just rush through them to get back to doing the things I love to do. And so that's the secret. Find out what you love to do in a way that supports the Oxfordian movement, and then do it to the greatest extent you can. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Thanks, James. I'm wondering how well did the Star of England do in your lines? Did you put the Star of England through your lines?
Oh, absolutely.
How well did she do, or they do? How many lines did you see?
Well, no, because I was only looking up through the mid-1930s. And
I'm just wondering if you put Star through that same
Oh, it's
scrutiny.
one of the most important books published, but it was after the time period I'm looking at in this presentation. And in fact, I would love to get authorization to reprint that book, bring it back into print, using an ISBN number purchased directly from Bowker's so that libraries and bookstores would pay attention to it. This Star of England, written by Dorothy Ogburn and Charlton Ogburn, published in 1952, October.
1,300 pages?
Yeah, it's 1,300 pages, small print, but it's a fascinating book.
Because I've read the book, and it seems she ticks all the boxes on all your lines.
Wait, I'm sorry?
You know, your lines of inquiry, I think
yeah.
the Star ticks the box on all of those.
Oh, I'm sure it does.
Jim, I'm a little confused about your Spencer reference. Are we talking Edmund?
Yes, we are.
Oh, we are?
Yes.
Okay, and are we talking as epic, or when you refer to?
Well, yeah, this is a line of evidence introduced by Percy Allen that wasn't followed up on by any of the other scholars that I just cited.
But where do we find it?
Yeah,
In which
it's
tome?
in his book published in 1934 titled Ancestral Elizabeth and Oxford. It's in volume 5 of my complete works of Percy Allen.
Okay, so you're not talking about Spencer's book that has
No, I'm
references
talking
to-
about Allen's, Percy Allen's analysis of, or
Spencer's,
interpretation
I see.
of Spencer's work.
I'm much less confused now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jim, I've got two comments and one question. Comment is, I had the pleasure of actually, you'd sent me an advanced copy of the 7 volumes that came. I started with volume 2, and which is basically his analysis of Johnson and Chapman, commenting on de Vere, which is something that I think all of us should be aware of.
That's volume 1, Alex. That's volume 1.
Well,
With Chapman and Johnson commenting on...
yes. I beg your pardon. I started with 2, and I skimmed volume 1. But what we should all be aware of, to a greater degree than I think many of us are, is that if a nobleman was writing poems and plays for the public in the 1590s, it would have been extremely hot news among all the literary associates in London at the time, and they would have been commenting on it. And in fact, that is exactly what they did. And we can learn an awful lot more about how all of this fits together, as Percy Allen shows, by analyzing Johnson and Chapman and all these other people who did make not so secret comments about it. My second comment is a stylistic one, which is, I would have to say, about Percy Allen's writing style. He never saw a comma that he didn't like.
In the introduction to one of the volumes, because each volume has a separate introduction, in addition to a general introduction, and in addition to a foreword written by Don Rubin, which I reprinted in all the volumes. I cited, that Percy Allen never met a comma he didn't like, and I put a paragraph in showing he used like 37 commas in a 10-line paragraph. So you have to get used to his style. And Alex, can I add a comment to your first comment?
Sure.
Which is that volume 1 of the collected writings is Allen's writings on Shakespeare before he became a publicly acknowledged Oxfordian. In volume 2, he writes about how he became an Oxfordian, and from then on, he states that Shakespeare is Edward de Vere. But in the first volume, he does not mention the authorship question or de Vere's authorship. And I'll add one more comment. Volume 4, if you're looking for an entry point into Shakespeare or Percy Allen's writings on Shakespeare, and you don't want to read all 7 volumes, start with volume 4. That's the life story of Edward de Vere as Shakespeare, the first biography of de Vere as Shakespeare. So that's the best volume. Volume 4 is the place to start.
My final point, then I'll hand the microphone
Alex.
to Shelley. A lot of people might not know, but you might want to comment on the fact of why Percy Allen kind of fell into disrepute following the death of his twin brother.
Okay, it's a complicated story, but Allen is less known today because, there's 3 factors. One is that the war intervened, and after the war, his works were not resurrected and reprinted after the war because Orthodox scholars wanted his evidence in support of Edward de Vere to be buried. So they had a reason to not bring his works back, even though he provided brilliant insights into Shakespeare's works themselves, apart from the authorship question. They decided that they could sacrifice that information, throw the baby out with the bathwater, in order to keep his evidence in support of Edward de Vere's authorship buried. The second theory, or the second aspect of that, is that the Oxfordians who ran the Shakespeare Fellowship after the war did not agree with the dynastic succession theory, the idea that Southampton was the son of Oxford and the Queen. And so they also threw the baby out with the bathwater. They were willing to throw out all the evidence that Allen uncovered in order to also bury the Prince Tudor or Sonnet's dynastic succession theory. So Oxfordians and Stratfordians both had reasons to bury Allen's work, or not resurrect it after the war had shut everything down in England. They might not have succeeded, except that Allen gave them the shovel that they needed to bury him. And that was after his twin brother died in 1939, I think on their 67th birthday. They had been very close, and after his brother died, he began to consult mediums or spiritual advisors to hold seances through which he could communicate with his brother. And then from there, he branched into meeting Esther Dowden, a medium who convinced him that she could put him in touch with Elizabethans, Edward de Vere, William Shakespeare, and Sir Francis Bacon. Still, all was well, but then he decided to write a book providing transcripts of his talks with these Elizabethans in a book titled Talks with Elizabethans, published in 1947. Well, when the board of directors of the Shakespeare Fellowship found out about this book, Allen at that time was president of the Shakespeare Fellowship. They forced him to resign, and he basically became a non-person in the fellowship for basically the rest of his life. They did invite him back to give a few talks for the fellowship, but each time he had to swear that he will not raise seances, the subject of seances or communicating with the spirits of those who had passed on. So that's why his work has become buried. And so, but there's so much in there, not only in support of Edward de Vere as Shakespeare, but so many insights he had and knowledge he brought to bear to help us understand the plays better, even apart from the authorship question. That's why I dedicated a year of my life to bringing all of his works back into print. Thank you.
Thus, an important fable of tolerance and acceptance.
Yes.
What I wanted to say is, on through Shakespeare by Another Name, on the Facebook page, there have been a few people who have actually been interested in in Percy Allen and the Chapman connections and things like that. Rambler, who wrote a blog called Quakespeare Shorterly. It's still up. It goes through tons of allusions in those plays. He was obsessed. He was really obsessed with them. It was really interesting. Also, Christopher Carolyn, who has presented at SOF, is very interested in some of those allusions and stuff too. So there are people who have read Allen and are really interested in that part. But it does involve reading a bunch of plays that are kind of hard to get your hands on a little bit. Chapman, not so much, but just every day, you don't see them on a bookstore shelf.
No, you don't.
You have to seek out these guys. So look at Allen, see what he was reading, and find it. You can get it. It might look
As I
expensive.
said, I added indexes and bibliographies to the book so that you can easily see what sources he consulted in his research.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much
Shelley.
for doing that.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.